In the isolated mountains of Appalachia in McDowell County, West Virginia, lies a story as revealing as it is disturbing, one that speaks to the dangers of extreme isolation and the consanguineous practices that can mark generations of a family. This is the tale of Ezekiel Thornton, a self-proclaimed pastor who, under religion's veil, perpetuated one of the most shocking documented cases of consanguineous union during the 1950s. For decades, the Thornton case remained hidden, shielded by geographical isolation and the code of silence that hovered over the small rural communities of post-war West Virginia. Not until 1978, when worried neighbors finally spurred local authorities to intervene, did the true extent of this family plot begin to surface. Ezekiel Thornton was born in 1911 on a small rural property outside of Welsh, the largest city in McDowell County. The son of miners, he grew up in a community already marked by isolation and by marriages between cousins, a relatively common practice in those remote mountains. Historical records show his own parents, Isaac and Martha Thornton, were second-degree cousins, a practice that, while questionable, was not unheard of in isolated regions of Appalachia in the early 20th century. At 19, after a brief period working in the coal mines that dominated the local economy, Ezekiel claimed to have received a divine call during a high fever brought on by pneumonia contracted deep in the mines. This episode, according to older community members interviewed years later, marked a radical change in his personality. The once quiet and reserved young miner emerged from his illness with an unusual religious fervor and the conviction that he had been chosen to found his own church, the Church of Purified Redemption, as Ezekiel named it. He established it in 1935 in a small wooden cabin built on Thornton family land. Initially, the congregation consisted only of nearby relatives and a few curious neighbors. What few realized, however, was how Ezekiel gradually began to shape his religious interpretation to justify practices that would serve his own interests. He talked about purifying the blood and preserving a chosen lineage, recalled Thomas Jenkins, one of the few community members who attended Thornton's early sermons before walking away, alarmed by their direction. He said God had shown him that families should remain united not only in spirit, but also in flesh, to preserve what he called the divine gift granted to his line. The 1940s and 1950s were marked by the growing isolation of the Thornton property. Ezekiel built a high fence around his land and discouraged contact with outsiders. It was during this period that he took full control over the lives of his three nieces, daughters of his younger sister, Rebecca, who died in 1947 from complications in childbirth, alongside her fourth daughter, who also did not survive. The girls, Mary, born in 1932, Sarah, in 1934, and Ruth, in 1936, were raised under the strict guardianship of their uncle, completely cut off from the outside world. Ezekiel assumed the roles of father, teacher, and pastor, controlling every aspect of their lives. County school records show none of the three attended local school after their mother's death, with Ezekiel telling the rare visiting authority that he was providing a scripture-based education at home. The true horror began to unfold when Mary turned 18 in 1950. In a ceremony Ezekiel described as a divine union ordered by the Lord, he forced his eldest niece to marry him. The ceremony was held in the small church on the property, with only family members present, all under the control and influence of the self-proclaimed pastor. If you're enjoying this story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You value tales that uncover the darkest truths of American society and the devastating impact of extreme isolation on rural communities. You need to sign up now. Our researched work brings to light cases history tried to bury. 2 years later, in 1952, Ezekiel held a second ceremony, this time marrying Sarah, then 18. The pattern repeated in 1954 when Ruth, the youngest, was also forced to join her uncle in a similar rite. What made the case even more disturbing was that officially, none of these marriages was recorded with the county. Ezekiel kept what he called the Sacred Book of Unions, where he documented his own ceremonies. Amelia Carter, a retired nurse who worked at Welsh Small Hospital during the 1950s and 60s, was among the first outside the immediate circle to suspect something was wrong. The girls appeared occasionally for medical care, always accompanied by Ezekiel, never alone, Carter reported to authorities years later. They were extremely shy, avoided eye contact, and showed signs of malnutrition and possible abuse. but at the time it was very difficult to intervene in the matters of isolated families. The consequences of these consanguineous unions were not slow to appear. Between 1951 and 1978, 12 births resulting from these unions were documented. Of these, 5 children died before the age of 5, presenting severe congenital malformations. Those who survived faced a range of health and developmental problems that grew more evident over time. Dr. William Harrison, a geneticist who later studied the case for the West Virginia Health Department, explained in his 1980 report, the offspring of these unions had an extremely high coefficient of consanguinity. We are not just talking about relatives marrying. We are talking about multiple generations of consanguineous marriage, culminating in unions between uncle and nieces who already carried shared genes from previous generations. The surviving children exhibited a range of conditions typical of high consanguinity: severe cognitive deficits, congenital heart problems, cleft palates, syndactyly, fused fingers, facial asymmetry, and compromised immune systems. James, the firstborn of the union with Mary in 1951, had a severe form of polydactyly, extra fingers on both hands and feet, as well as a profound intellectual disability that prevented him from developing language, even into adulthood. Life on the Thornton property followed a strict pattern laid down by Ezekiel. The 3 women and their children lived in precarious conditions, working the small farm that provided the family's subsistence. The isolation was nearly total. The children never attended school, were never vaccinated, and rarely left the property. Ezekiel justified this isolation through his preaching, claiming the outside world was contaminated and that only his family had been chosen to preserve the purity of their lineage. He established a rigid set of rules, including collective prayer 4 times a day and severe physical punishments for any questioning of his authority. The situation remained this way for almost 3 decades, protected by isolation and by the reluctance of local authorities to interfere in family affairs, a common attitude in the rural areas of West Virginia at the time. It was not until 1978, when one of the children, Daniel, born in 1962 from the union with Sarah, managed to escape the property and seek help, that the case finally came under investigation. Daniel, then 16, reached the town of Welsh after walking almost 20 kilometers through the mountains. Despite his impaired development and communication difficulties, he conveyed enough details about the situation on the Thornton property to justify an official investigation. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who led the first visit to the property in October 1978, described the scene as something out of another century. He recalled, the property was in deplorable condition, with deteriorated structures and clear signs of extreme poverty. The children, many clearly displaying physical deformities, seemed scared and malnourished. Ezekiel, then 67, still maintained absolute control over everyone through what I can only describe as a combination of religious and physical intimidation. The Thornton case presented a significant legal dilemma. In 1978, West Virginia had no specific laws addressing consanguineous marriage within isolated religious contexts. Furthermore, none of the marriages had been officially registered, they existed only in the ceremonies led by Ezekiel himself. However, evidence of child neglect, forced isolation, and inadequate living conditions was enough for McDowell County Social Services to obtain a court order to remove the children. In total, 7 children, ranging from 3 to 16 years old, were taken from the site and placed into state care. The psychological impact on the 3 women, Mary, Sarah, and Ruth, was immediately evident to the professionals who worked with them after the intervention. Decades of isolation and indoctrination had created a deep conditioning that made it extremely difficult for them to conceive of a different life. Dr. Eleanor Montgomery, a psychologist who worked with the 3, documented, "We observed a classic case of what we now call Stockholm Syndrome, combined with elements of extreme religious indoctrination. The patient showed profoundly rooted emotional dependence on their captor, an inability to recognize the abusive nature of their situation, and strong initial resistance to any external intervention." The 3 sisters initially resisted being separated from Ezekiel, a common reaction in victims of long-term abuse and psychological manipulation. They genuinely believed they were fulfilling a divine destiny, Dr. Montgomery explained. A long therapeutic process was needed to begin to help them recognize the exploitative nature of their situation. Detailed medical examinations of the children revealed the true impact of extreme consanguinity. Dr. Robert Collins, a pediatrician who evaluated the 7 minors, documented, beyond the evident physical malformations, we observed a series of less visible but equally debilitating conditions: severe immunological deficiencies, cardiac issues, neurological developmental delays, and a predisposition to conditions like epilepsy. The genetics behind the Thornton case became an object of scientific study in the following years. The coefficient of consanguinity, a measure of the probability that an individual inherits identical genes from both parents, was exceptionally high in the Thornton children. Dr. Harrison explained, even in marriages between first-degree cousins, the coefficient is approximately 6%. In the Thornton children, we estimate values between 20% and 25%, considering not only the uncle-niece relationship but also the history of prior consanguinity in the family. This high degree of genetic kinship resulted in the expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes, mutations that normally remain inactive when present in only one copy, but manifest when inherited from both parents. It is as if we are seeing the materialization of all the genetic burden accumulated by generations in this family. If you are following this story, I ask you to leave the phrase in the comments: "True darkness lies in the isolation that allows horrors to remain hidden." Your voice is important so that cases like this are not forgotten, and so we can continue to bring to light the stories society needs to hear. Ezekiel Thornton's trial began in March 1979, attracting regional media attention, though it was largely shielded from national scrutiny due to its sensitive nature and concerns for victim privacy. Thornton, then 68, remained unyielding in his belief that he was fulfilling a divine mission. At one particularly disturbing moment during the trial, he stated, "What you call wrong, I call sacred. What you call disease, I call the mark of divine choice." Psychological experts who evaluated him diagnosed a combination of delusional disorder with elements of narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. Calvin Matthews, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Thornton, concluded, the defendant developed an elaborate delusional system centered on distorted religious beliefs that conveniently legitimized his desires and behaviors. There is no evidence he does not understand the nature or consequences of his actions. He simply justifies them through his own belief system. The verdict came in June 1979. Ezekiel Thornton was found guilty on multiple counts, including child neglect, forced isolation, and exploitation of vulnerable dependents. While charges related to the consanguineous unions were complicated by the lack of official records, medical evidence and testimony were enough to secure a 25-year sentence. Thornton died in state custody in 1984 at age 73, never expressing remorse. For the nieces and their children, the path to recovery was long and complex. Mary, Sarah, and Ruth underwent extensive psychological rehabilitation, initially housed together in a facility specializing in long-term abuse victims. Gradually, they began to rebuild their identities and autonomy. Dr. Peter Lawrence, director of the rehabilitation program, noted, the challenge was not only to treat the trauma of abuse, but literally to teach these women how to live in the modern world. Things we take for granted, like shopping, using a telephone, or making independent decisions, were completely foreign to them after decades of isolation and control. Progress came gradually. Ruth, the youngest, adapted more readily and eventually obtained a basic education, completing the equivalent of elementary school in a special program at age 47. Mary and Sarah, who had spent more years under Ezekiel's control, made more limited, but still significant, progress. For the children, the challenges were even more complex. The health problems caused by extreme consanguinity required constant medical care. Many also had significant cognitive developmental delays, needing specialized educational programs. James, the eldest son, spent most of his adulthood in a specialized care facility, never achieving full independence due to the severity of his cognitive deficits. Elizabeth, Ruth's daughter born in 1972, partially overcame her limitations, eventually completing high school in an adapted program and working in a sheltered environment. Daniel, whose escape had enabled the intervention, became a symbol of resilience. Despite learning difficulties and chronic health problems, he adapted to life outside the Thornton property. At 25, he gave a rare interview to a local newspaper, stating, "I don't always understand the outside world, but I know it's better than what we lived." Sometimes I still have nightmares about that place, about those voices telling us we were special when we were actually being destroyed. The genetic impact of consanguinity continued to manifest in subsequent generations. Even the children who went on to have their own children with unrelated partners still carried a compromised genetic burden. Dr. Jessica Reynolds, a geneticist who followed the case long-term, explained, even after consanguineous marriages stopped, deleterious mutations remained in the family's genetic pool. We observed a significantly higher incidence of conditions like autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular problems, and certain cognitive deficits in descendants, even when inbreeding was no longer present. The Thornton case also significantly impacted public policy in West Virginia. In 1981, the state revised its child protection laws, establishing stricter protocols for investigating isolated families and closed communities. Specific training programs were created for health, education, and social service professionals to identify signs of potential abuse in contexts of extreme isolation. Sociologist Dr. Martin Reynolds, who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 3 decades, noted, the Thornton case is an extreme example, but not a complete anomaly. The mountainous regions of Appalachia have historically housed communities with high levels of geographical and social isolation, creating conditions conducive to practices like close-kin marriage. What makes Thornton exceptional is the element of distorted religious control and the extent of consanguinity over multiple generations. Subsequent studies identified several other isolated communities in the region with high rates of consanguineous marriage, though none as extreme as the Thornton case. These findings led to public health initiatives focused on these areas, including educational programs on the genetic risks of consanguinity and improved access to health services. The Thornton property, the stage for this dark history, stood abandoned for years after the authorities' intervention. In 1992, it was finally demolished by county order, declared unfit for habitation and a monument to a tragedy the community wished to forget. Where the Church of Purified Redemption once stood, a small grove was planted as a silent memorial. A discreet plaque installed in 2005, at the initiative of survivors and professionals involved in the case, bears the inscription, in memory of those whose voices were silenced. May their story teach us vigilance against the isolation that allows suffering to remain hidden. The medical, psychological, and genetic records of the Thornton case became important educational tools for health, social work, and law enforcement. Medical schools in regional universities often use it as a case study on the biological effects of extreme consanguinity, while social worker training programs analyze it as an example of the dangers of social and religious isolation. Mary Thornton died in 1998 at age 66 from heart complications, a common health problem in her family. Sarah lived until 2010, reaching 76 despite several chronic conditions. Ruth, the youngest sister, was still alive as of 2015, residing in an assisted living community specializing in long-term trauma survivors. Of the 7 children rescued in 1978, 4 had died by 2015, all before reaching 50. The 3 survivors continued to face various health challenges requiring constant medical care. Daniel, whose courage had exposed the case, died in 2012 at age 50 due to congenital heart complications, a stark reminder of the genetic legacy he carried. Elizabeth, who had achieved the greatest degree of independence among the children, became a quiet advocate for awareness about the dangers of consanguinity. She occasionally participated in lectures at medical schools and social work programs, sharing her experience. In one rare public appearance in 2008, she said, "I carry the marks of this story in my genes, my body, and my mind. Every day is a fight against the legacy that was imposed on me before I was born. I speak about it not because it is easy, but because silence allows stories like mine to keep happening." Dr. William Harrison, who had studied the case genetically, published an extensive longitudinal study in 2005 on the effects of consanguinity observed in the Thornton family. His conclusions were alarming. The increased homozygosity, having identical alleles at a genetic locus, resulted in an unprecedented expression of deleterious recessive traits. We observed not only obvious physical malformations, but also a dramatically increased susceptibility to various conditions, autoimmune diseases, metabolic disorders, a predisposition to certain cancers, and a significant reduction in life expectancy. This study became a reference in medical literature on consanguinity, cited as one of the most extreme and well-documented cases of the biological effects of multi-generational close-kin marriage. From a sociological perspective, the case generated important reflections on how isolated communities can develop and normalize harmful practices. Dr. Angela Morrison, an anthropologist specializing in isolated rural communities, noted, "The Thornton case illustrates how extreme isolation, combined with unchallenged religious authority, can create environments where clearly harmful practices become normalized. The lack of exposure to broader social norms and the absence of external checks allowed this situation to persist for decades." The legacy of the Thornton case in local culture is complex. On one hand, there remains an understandable reluctance to openly discuss such a disturbing episode. On the other, the case served as a catalyst for significant changes in how isolated communities are monitored and how social services operate in the region. Sheriff Anderson, who led the initial intervention, reflected years later, before the Thornton case, there was a widespread attitude of non-interference in how families lived, especially in remote areas. This case showed us that extreme isolation can hide terrible abuse, and that we have a collective responsibility to ensure the well-being of all community members, especially the most vulnerable. Today, the story of Ezekiel Thornton stands as a dark reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, religious manipulation, and the devastating effects of prolonged consanguinity. It is also a testament to human resilience, to the courage of a young man who, despite all the limitations imposed upon him, found the strength to seek help and end generations of abuse. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "watched" so I can know you and see who truly appreciates the deep stories here on the channel. If this report touched you in any way, be sure to like this video and share it. Stories like this need to be told so we can learn from past mistakes and remain vigilant against the isolation that allows such horrors to fester. Subscribe to the channel to learn more historical cases that reveal truths society often prefers to ignore.